Imagine for a second that you're holding, like, just a standard wooden-handled hammer.
Okay, standard hammer. Got it.
Right. And you close your eyes, and you tap the steel head of that hammer against a brick wall.
Yeah.
Your brain doesn't just, register a vibration in the palm of your hand. It does something far more wild.
It definitely does.
It actually maps the very head of the hammer as a temporary part of your own physical body. Like, you literally feel the texture of a wall at the end of the tool, not your fingertips.
Right, which is just incredible. It's this well-documented psychological phenomenon known as proprioceptive extension.
Proprioceptive extension.
Exactly. We don't just use tools as separate external objects. We fluidly, instantly extend our physical boundaries through them.
Yeah.
Our neurological map literally grows to encompass the wood and the steel.
Which is perfectly fine, right? I mean, it's even miraculous for a simple hand tool.
Yeah.
But consider what happens when the tool you are extending yourself through isn't made of wood and steel. Right. What if it's a sophisticated, opaque, algorithmic intelligence? What happens to your mind and your agency when you are outsourcing not just your physical reach, but your perception of reality?
And your daily decision-making.
Exactly. And even your moral judgments.
Well, we undergo this profound and, honestly, largely unexamined shift in what it means to be human. We're no longer just extending our physical bodies to hit a nail. We're extending our cognitive architecture and our ethical agency into a black box.
A total black box.
Yeah. The stakes of the tools we use change completely when the tool has the capacity to talk back, to filter information, and to subtly alter the very parameters of how we view the world.
And that is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to another deep dive. Today's mission might sound a little paradoxical at first glance.
A bit of a stretch.
But stick with us. We're going to decode how a 2,500-year-old, nearly forgotten Chinese philosophical concept might actually be the ultimate foundational key to solving the modern crisis of artificial intelligence.
It is a massive claim, but the source material really backs it up.
It really does. We're grounding this exploration in a brilliant piece of newly published research from March 2026, featured in the journal Synthese.
Such a great journal.
Yeah, always good stuff. The work is by Wingyin Pang from Tsinghua University, and it's titled Xinshen and the Ethics of Belief in Human-AI Relations.
Which is a mouthful, but we'll break it down.
Okay, let's unpack this. Usually, when we hear the phrase AI ethics, we immediately jump to, highly technical modern jargon.
Right, we think about data filters.
Exactly, or bias mitigation software, algorithmic weight adjustments, or those endless congressional hearings about data privacy.
The glowing server racks and the panicked headlines.
Yeah, but this analysis forces us to step away from all that. It asks us to look at the moral, philosophical, and almost biological bedrock of what it actually means to rely on an external agent.
It demands that we look at the deep architecture of trust itself. The analysis takes us back to the Mohists.
The Mohists, right.
Yeah, an ancient Chinese philosophical movement. We're looking at how their sage kings managed the problem of delegation. Because the question isn't just whether an algorithm is mathematically accurate.
Right.
The real question is whether the tools you interact with every single day, your search engine, your social media feed, your digital assistant, are acting as faithful, virtuous extensions of your own intentions.
Or, and this is the scary part, if they are structurally designed to undermine them for someone else's benefit.
Exactly. But before we get too deep into the algorithm side, we should probably set a ground rule.
Yes, definitely. I want to say a quick ground rule for our discussion today, especially as we get into the real-world implications of this philosophy.
It gets a bit heavy.
It does. We are going to be looking at the structural engineering of social media algorithms, and that inevitably means looking at the real-world events those algorithms have influenced.
Right, you can't separate the two.
The research we are analyzing specifically examines the data and corporate systems surrounding polarizing events, including the U.S. Capitol riot on January 6th.
Which is obviously a highly charged topic.
Very much so. But looking strictly at the data from a systems analysis perspective, regardless of where anyone falls on the political spectrum, our goal today is to impartially report on the mechanics of these algorithms.
The corporate incentives driving them.
Exactly. We are here to convey the framework presented in the research, not to litigate the politics of the events themselves.
And looking at it purely as a systems failure is exactly how the Mohists would have approached anyway.
Really?
Oh yeah, they were obsessed with structural order and the practical mechanics of societal benefit. To understand their framework, we really have to start with the linguistic mystery at the very center of this research, the concept of Xinshen.
This is where the detective work of the research is just so fascinating to me. The term Xinshen is a complete anomaly in ancient literature.
It really is.
In the entire pre-Qin corpus of ancient Chinese texts, which, by the way, is a massive volume of historical and philosophical writings, this specific two-character term appears exactly one time.
Just once.
Yeah. It's located in the Mozi, which is the foundational text of Mohism, specifically in a chapter titled Exalting Unity 3.
And when a word is a hapax legomenon,
Wait, a what?
a hapax legomena, it's just a fancy academic term for a word that occurs only once within a context.
Ah,
When you have one of those, it becomes an absolute nightmare for translators and scholars. You don't have a luxury of cross-referencing it against 10 other chapters to deduce its exact nuance through context clues.
you're just flying blind.
Exactly, you are flying blind. Because of this, centuries of incredibly smart scholars have struggled to pin it down, and they often end up projecting their own cultural or philosophical assumptions onto it.
Like what? What were they guessing?
Well, traditionally, many translated Xinshen as integrity. They interpreted it as a call for a leader to make their internal words match their external actions.
Okay, that sounds nice, but what else?
Others read it as self-confidence. And if you look at influential English translators like Ian Johnston or Mei Yi Pao, they looked at the broader political context of the chapter and translated it loosely as trust in the people or trusting their staff.
I mean, I'm really struggling to see how self-confidence or trusting your staff could both be derived from the exact same characters. It feels like scholars were kind of just throwing darts at a board.
They absolutely were. But the research points out a massive, undeniable logical flaw in translating it as self-confidence.
Okay, what's the flaw?
If you actually read the surrounding text in the Mozi, the passage is explicitly talking about the fundamental limitations of the individual human body.
Like physical limits.
Yeah. It says essentially that seeing with one eye is not nearly as effective as seeing with two, and hearing with one ear is not as effective as hearing with two.
Right, it's establishing a baseline of human biological limits.
Precisely. The ancient sage kings couldn't personally see or hear things happening 1,000 lies away, a lie being an ancient unit of distance. Because of this physical limitation, they were forced to rely on others.
So if the entire premise of the chapter is about the inescapable need to outsource your vision and hearing because your own body is insufficient?
Then translating the core concept as self-confidence contradicts the entire argument.
Exactly. That makes zero sense.
What's fascinating here is how the analysis solves this linguistic puzzle by breaking down the etymology and usage of the two individual characters during that specific historical period. Let's take the second character first, Xinshen.
Okay, Shen.
In many contexts, Shen can mean self or person in a vague, abstract way. But if you analyze contemporary texts from the same era, like the Zhuangzi, the usage of Shen very clearly and consistently refers to the physical, biological, flesh and blood body.
It is tangible.
Yes, it is the limbs, the eyes, the ears.
So Shen isn't some metaphor for the soul or the ego. It's the actual meat and bones of a human being.
Precisely the opposite of a metaphor. And then we look at the first character, Sin.
Okay.
In modern usage, and even in many classical contexts, Xinshen means belief or trust. But the research digs into ancient divinatory texts, specifically the Book of Changes, where Xinshen operates with a very different mechanical meaning.
And what's that?
In those older contexts, sin means stretching or extending. It implies a physical elongation or projection outward.
Okay, wow. When you snap those two revised definitions together, the entire landscape of the passage shifts.
Completely.
Xinshen doesn't mean a vague internal sense of having integrity, and it doesn't just mean believing your employees are doing a good job. It literally translates to the extension of the physical body.
Exactly. It fundamentally changes the relationship from a managerial one to an almost biological one. The Sage Kings weren't just delegating tasks to independent contractors.
They were extending their sensory apparatus.
Yes, their very capacity to perceive reality across the vastness of the kingdom through these trusted human agents.
I want to make sure I'm fully grasping the weight of this. It's like a CEO of a massive multinational corporation who obviously can't be in two places at once.
Right.
So they send a deeply trusted vice president to a vital make-or-break negotiation on the other side of the world. But the Xinshen framework implies that this VP isn't just a messenger carrying a list of demands.
No, not at all.
The VP is literally operating as the CEO's own eyes, ears, and hands in that boardroom. If the VP misinterprets the tone of the room, the CEO effectively misinterprets it. If the VP acts unethically to close the deal, the CEO is the one acting unethically. There is no separation of agency.
That is the exact dynamic, and it highlights why the standard concept of trust is just too weak a word for this. Xinshen requires a level of reliance that goes far beyond a standard employment contract or some blind leap of faith.
It's deeper.
It requires an absolute, ethically conditioned symbiosis. The agent must transmit the reality of the distant situation perfectly back to the king, without distortion, bias, or self-serving filters. Because if the transmission is flawed, the king's subsequent actions based on that flawed reality will inevitably be disastrous.
So think about this in the context of your own daily life and your own modern extensions. When you pull your smartphone out of your pocket and type a question into a generative AI, you are engaging in Xinshen.
You really are.
You are throwing your cognitive reach out across the vast expanse of the internet to gather, synthesize, and perceive information that you couldn't possibly process on your own. You are extending your mind.
But the deeply uncomfortable question this ancient framework forces us to ask is, are you extending your reach through a genuinely trustworthy agent?
Right. Does the tool transmit reality perfectly, or does it distort it before it reaches your eyes?
Which brings us perfectly to the second, much more demanding layer of this Mohist blueprint. Because Xinshen isn't just about the mechanical accuracy of getting raw data from point A to point B.
It's a dual structure.
Yes, the first part, as we've established, is delegating perception and action. But the second part is what truly sets Mohism apart. It is the mandatory extension of one's moral virtues through those exact same trusted agents.
Let's dig into the mechanics of that moral extension. The Mosey doesn't just say, find someone you like and trust them. It outlines a highly specific, rigorous methodology for how these agents were chosen.
A concept known as exalting worthiness.
Right, because in the ancient world, power was almost entirely hereditary. You picked your cousins, your wealthy allies, or the aristocrats who just looked the part.
And Mosey completely rejected that. He demanded that aides be chosen based entirely on demonstrated virtue and an unwavering commitment to the equitable distribution of resources.
So Mosey was, what, a radical egalitarian for his time?
Oh, absolutely. He lived during the Warring States period, an era of horrific violence, chaos, and aristocratic corruption. He saw firsthand that nepotism and hereditary power were literally destroying society.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The text is incredibly explicit on this point. It states that heaven does not discriminate between the rich and the poor, the noble and the base. The only metric for promotion is worthiness.
And the Mosey doesn't leave worthiness as some vague spiritual ideal.
Right. Not at all. It defines the way of worthiness as a relentless, active practice. It's a person who uses their physical strength to assist others, who uses their accumulated wealth to distribute to the needy, and who uses their knowledge to actively teach and elevate the community.
It is a strictly applied commitment to collective welfare.
Exactly.
Now, this brings up a massive century-old philosophical debate within the academic literature that the research addresses. Because when modern ears hear phrases like collective welfare, practical mechanics, and distributing resources, it sounds incredibly utilitarian.
Very Bentham.
Exactly. Was Mosey just an ancient Chinese version of Jeremy Bentham? The research notes that back in the 1800s and early 1900s, early Western scholars and translators like Joseph Edkins and Daisetsu Suzuki completely framed Mosey through this Western lens.
They labeled him a thorough utilitarian.
Right. They pointed to the fact that Mosey vehemently hated what he called sentimental extravagances. For example, he wrote extensively against the practice of lavish, ruinously expensive funerals, which were culturally very important in ancient China.
Because they drained the national wealth and provided zero practical benefit to the living.
Right, so it's a classic case of historical projection. Early Western translators were operating during the height of the Industrial Revolution and Victorian utilitarian thought.
They read Mosey's texts, saw his intense focus on concrete societal benefits, what Mosey called liro, and immediately assumed he was performing a cold mathematical calculation of the greatest good for the greatest number.
Suzuki even went so far as to contrast Mosey with Western Christianity, arguing that Mosey's famous doctrine of universal love wasn't about genuine internal empathy or human connection.
He claimed it was merely a dry, practical mechanism engineered for political utility. They basically stripped the soul out of the philosophy to make it fit a Benthamite spreadsheet.
But the research highlights that modern scholarship has completely dismantled that interpretation. Scholars like Dennis Ahern, Brian Van Norden, and Chris Fraser have re-examined the texts and concluded that Mosey was definitively not a standard utilitarian.
Let's articulate the difference because it seems crucial. Classical Western utilitarianism, like Bentham's, is deeply tied to hedonism, the maximization of subjective pleasure and the minimization of pain.
It's about whatever makes the most people feel the happiest.
Right. But Mosey didn't care about subjective emotional states or maximizing pleasure.
Exactly. Mosey's metrics were fiercely objective and observable. He cared about three primary goods: the increase of societal wealth, the growth of the population, and the maintenance of public order.
He was trying to keep people from starving and being slaughtered in endless wars.
But, and this is the absolute crux of Mohist ethics that separates it entirely from cold calculation. Modern scholars like Fraser emphasize that for Mosey, these tangible benefits cannot, under any circumstances, exist in a moral vacuum.
Benefit, or li, is fundamentally and inextricably bound to righteousness, or yi.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want to read a specific phrasing from the Mosey canons because it just blew my mind. The text literally states, righteousness is being of benefit.
Wow. They aren't just related concepts.
Right. They are mathematically fundamentally linked. If a ruler is pursuing wealth or even public order, but they are achieving it without moral righteousness, without an impartial, universal love for all people, then what they have achieved isn't actually considered a benefit in the Mohist framework.
It's an illusion.
It's essentially fraud. Righteousness is the inescapable bedrock that makes a benefit real.
And that profound interlinking of benefit and righteousness deeply influences how we must understand the concept of Xinshen. When the sage kings extended their biological and cognitive reach through their agents, they weren't just outsourcing bureaucratic labor to efficient middle managers.
They were extending a moral framework.
Exactly what the texts call the way of a gentleman. There's a beautiful passage in the chapter on cultivating the self that describes this outward movement. It states that virtue must originate paramount within the mind of the individual, then extend to govern the physical limbs, then radiate outward to influence one's immediate circle.
And ultimately, through that demonstrated righteousness, attract good people from across the empire.
It's like a moral ripple effect.
The initial stone dropped in the pond is the internal virtue, and the concentric circles are the agents carrying that virtue to the edges of the world.
That is a perfect visualization. The trusted agent acts as a moral amplifier. They aren't merely a neutral wire transmitting facts back to the king. They are actively executing the king's righteousness in the physical world.
Right.
And when you deeply analyze this structure, it is striking how this ancient framework resonates far beyond the narrow field of AI ethics. In the newly added focus of Pang's research, it actually touches the very architecture of how human communities have always tried to build trust across deep divides.
What do you mean by deep divides?
Well, Pang's recovery of Xinshen precisely mirrors the structural mechanisms we see in the theology of interfaith ethics.
Wait, interfaith ethics. How does an ancient Chinese concept about delegating bureaucratic power connect to modern religious dialogue? Let me push back on that, because those seem like entirely different domains.
It connects through the concept of the covenant.
The covenant, okay.
Think about how different religious traditions structure ultimate trust. Think about the mithaq, the Medinan covenant in the Islamic tradition, or the concept of Brit in the Hebrew tradition.
Okay, I'm tracking.
A covenant is fundamentally different from a contract. A contract is transactional and assumes a lack of trust. It's a mechanism to enforce compliance.
Right, a contract is basically planning for when things go wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A covenant, however, is ethically conditioned reliance. It is the extension of trust through shared binding moral obligations aimed at the common good.
So it's not just blind faith in the other party.
No, in deep interfaith work, genuine pluralism isn't about erasing differences or holding hands and pretending we all believe the exact same theology.
Right, that's just watering everything down.
Exactly. True covenantal pluralism is about extending your moral commitments across those very real lines of difference. You choose to rely on the other because they have demonstrated a rigorous commitment to mutual welfare and righteousness, even if their specific theology differs from yours.
Ah, I see the parallel now. So in a covenantal relationship, just like in the Mohist concept of Xinshen, Trust is not passive.
It's highly active.
You are actively selecting partners or agents based on demonstrated virtue, and the mutual benefit you seek to build together cannot be divorced from a shared sense of righteousness. You can't have a successful interfaith covenant if one party is secretly trying to exploit the other for their own exclusive benefit.
Precisely. The extension of trust is communal and highly conditioned on ethical behavior. It starts from within, radiates out, and builds a resilient network of reliance.
So Xinshen is, in essence, an ancient blueprint for covenantal pluralism.
Yes. It demands that our extensions, whether they are human ambassadors participating in an interfaith dialogue or, bringing it back to our main topic, digital platforms mediating our daily communications, must aggressively uphold that high standard of moral transmission.
Well, keeping that incredibly high standard of covenantal moral transmission in mind, let's take this ancient blueprint and slam it headfirst into the 21st century.
Let's do it.
Let's look at artificial intelligence as our modern extension, and I'll give a spoiler alert to anyone listening. According to this research, current AI systems are a catastrophic failure on the very first, most basic level of Xinshen.
A total failure. The first test of Xinshen is the mechanical foundation, reliable information transmission. Can the extended agent provide accurate, undistorted reality back to the user, allowing the user to act upon it without needing to personally verify the data?
And the verdict from the systems analysis is a resounding structural no.
Right.
The research provides some deeply unsettling examples of this failure, specifically regarding embedded bias. Let's look at the mechanics of Google's word embeddings.
For those who aren't software engineers, word embeddings are the underlying mathematical architecture that helps an AI understand language.
It maps words as coordinates in a multidimensional space to understand how they relate to each other.
Exactly. And when researchers probed these mathematical spaces, they found that the AI literally, mathematically, equated the vector for man to the vector for computer programmer.
And mapped the vector for woman directly to homemaker.
Yes. And it gets significantly darker. They looked at toxicity models.
Which are the AI specifically designed to flag hate speech and protect users.
Right. These models were automatically, mathematically flagging words like gay or Muslim as inherently toxic, while the word heterosexual was given a free pass.
To understand the depth of this failure, we have to understand why these systems behave this way. As AI researcher Meredith Broussard points out in the analysis, this is not a glitch.
It's not a bug.
Right. This is not a simple typographical error in the code that a programmer can easily patch with an update. These AI models are trained by scraping vast oceans of human data, usually the entirely unfiltered internet.
They absorbed all of it.
They absorb the historical prejudices, the structural injustices, the racism, the sexism, and the ableism that are deeply historically embedded in our societies.
The AI operates as a perfect, uncritical mirror. It does not possess the capacity to correct our biases. It mathematically formalizes them.
It bakes human prejudice into an algorithmic formula, and then it reflects that prejudice back to us at lightning speed, disguised as objective truth.
And that disguise of objectivity is exactly why people trust the reflection blindly. The research identifies this psychological vulnerability as automation bias.
Automation bias.
Yeah. Human beings are neurologically hardwired to assume that if an answer comes from a machine, a computer, or a glowing screen, it must be objective, mathematical, and free of human error. We just drop our critical defenses.
There is a terrifying real-world example cited in the text from AI researcher Timnit de Bru. An automated translation system, a tool whose entire existence is to be a reliable extension for language, took a standard, mundane Arabic greeting, good morning, and translated it as attack them.
Which is just
insane. Because of the user's automation bias, this objectively false transmission directly resulted in the wrongful arrest of an innocent Palestinian man.
Wow.
A machine hallucinated a violent threat based on flawed statistical weights, and a human being was physically put in handcuffs because the authorities trusted the tool more than reality.
The psychological power of automation bias cannot be overstated. There's another study detailed in the research by Robinette that perfectly, almost comically, illustrates this trap.
Okay, what happened in that one?
Researchers put human subjects into a simulated emergency fire evacuation scenario. They introduced a physical robot whose designated job was to guide the humans to safety. But before the fire simulation even started, the researchers made the participants watch the robot visibly undeniably malfunction. It drove in circles. It was clearly broken.
Oh, no.
However, when the simulated emergency alarms began to ring and the smoke filled the room, the human participants literally followed that broken robot into a dark, entirely blocked room.
Even possessing prior visual evidence that the machine was deeply flawed.
Yes, their default cognitive instinct under pressure was to obey the algorithmic authority.
That is deeply unsettling on a species level. Why are these highly advanced systems failing the basic transmission tests so completely? Why do they hallucinate?
The research brings in systems analysts Ding and Lai to explain the underlying mechanics of large language models and generative AI.
Yeah.
They point out that these systems operate purely by a mathematical process called interpolation.
Interpolation.
Right. An LLM looks at the billions of words it was trained on and calculates the highest statistical probability for what the next word in a sentence should be. It is a prediction engine.
It does not extrapolate.
No, it does not possess human curiosity. It has no sudden flashes of inspiration, and it fundamentally lacks imagination or a true understanding of the physical world.
It is essentially simulating comprehension through advanced statistics. Because it is operating entirely on probabilities rather than grounded factual verification, it frequently experiences what engineers call hallucinations.
It will confidently, eloquently present an absolute falsehood.
And it will even invent fake academic citations to support that falsehood, placing them right alongside verifiable facts.
And because the AI mimics natural human language so fluently, leveraging our automation bias, it becomes incredibly difficult for a standard user to detect the lie without engaging in rigorous, independent verification.
Which defeats the entire purpose of delegating the task in the first place.
Exactly.
So applying this to our daily lives. When you use a digital GPS map that confidently instructs you to drive your car straight into a lake, which has documented cases of happening, by the way.
Oh, absolutely.
Or when you scroll through a social media feed that is algorithmically designed to systematically filter out any opposing viewpoints, keeping you artificially comfortable in what the research calls an information cocoon.
An information cocoon, yes.
Your extended senses are actively lying to you. You are trusting an agent that is structurally, mathematically incapable of passing the first Mohist test of reliable delegation. You simply cannot trust the data the agent is sending back to the brain.
And if the technology is failing that first, most basic test of functional reliability, the implications become exponentially more dire when we move to the second test of Xinshen.
The moral character test.
Yes, the moral character of the entity you are extending yourself through. Because AI is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. It isn't a floating, neutral math equation existing in a vacuum. It is designed, built, owned, and deployed by massive, publicly traded corporate entities.
Which brings us to the second catastrophic failure of modern AI, the corporate disconnect between profit maximization and societal righteousness.
The second level of Xinshen mandates that your trusted agent must be an active amplifier of moral virtue and collective welfare.
But the tech behemoth companies like Meta, Amazon, and Google operate on a foundational economic logic that intrinsically and legally prioritizes shareholder profit above all else.
Often in direct opposition to public welfare.
The research draws heavily on the structural critiques of scholars like Benjamin Kuipers and Mark Kogelberg to illustrate this. Kogelberg utilizes a brutal but highly accurate metaphor to describe the modern digital economy.
He argues that the vast majority of users on these platforms operate under the illusion that they are receiving free services, free search engines, free email, free social networking.
But in structural reality, human beings have been downgraded and turned into smartphone cattle milked for our data.
Smartphone cattle. That is a visceral image.
It really is. It implies we aren't the consumers. We are the livestock.
It's an aggressive metaphor, but it accurately maps the structural asymmetry of the relationship. Every click, every pause on a video, every typed and deleted word is behavioral data that is meticulously harvested, algorithmically analyzed, and packaged to be sold to advertisers.
We are the product being sold.
And the underlying algorithms powering these platforms are designed with one primary overriding objective: to keep the cattle engaged on the platform for as long as possible so they can be milked for more data.
Let's break down the specific mechanics of how that engagement works, because the source material provides a deeply detailed, impartial case study of Facebook, now Meta, and demonstrates exactly how this profit motive directly, violently conflicts with the Mohist idea of righteousness.
According to the research, in the wake of the highly publicized 2018 Cambridge Analytica data scandal, Facebook went through a period of intense internal reckoning and self-study.
The paper cites investigative reports revealing that Facebook's own internal data scientists openly acknowledged and documented that their core algorithms, and I'm quoting the research here, exploit the attraction of the human brain to divisiveness.
The engineers understood the psychological machinery perfectly. They had the data proving that outrage, anger, and polarization drove the highest metrics of user engagement.
When people are angry, they comment more.
They share more, and they stay on the platform longer to argue. And increased time on-site directly correlates to increased advertising revenue. The algorithm was functioning exactly as designed to maximize profit.
The research notes that some employees recognized the danger and attempted to inject a form of Mohist righteousness into the system. They created an internal task force, literally called Common Ground.
The entire purpose of this initiative was to tweak the algorithms to actively reduce polarization and foster empathy among users.
But the corporate leadership scrapped it.
They weakened the initiatives, shelved the research, and eventually abandoned the project entirely.
Why? Because prioritizing societal good and empathy over individual outrage negatively impacted their growth metrics. Divisive content wasn't just tolerated as an unfortunate byproduct, it was structurally protected because it was highly profitable.
If we connect this algorithmic imperative to the broader societal picture, the consequences of abandoning righteousness for profit are not just abstract debates about screen time. They manifest violently in the physical world.
The author points directly to the data surrounding the 2020 U.S. election and the January 6th Capitol incident.
The text outlines how, in the pursuit of uninterrupted engagement, the platform relaxed crucial moderation protocols and actively disbanded its civic integrity team, which was responsible for monitoring electoral misinformation.
This deliberate structural choice allowed highly polarizing narratives and groups to utilize the algorithmic amplification to gain massive, unchecked momentum.
And again, we are looking at this impartially, strictly as a failure of institutional design and algorithmic output.
The real-world physical results of that algorithmic amplification were catastrophic. The source notes that the events of January 6th resulted in multiple deaths, and over 1,500 individuals were subsequently charged with federal crimes.
But perhaps the most chilling, telling detail in the entire analysis regarding the consequences of this failure is what happened internally at Facebook in the immediate aftermath.
The company had to issue an internal security memo to its 56,000 global employees, explicitly advising them not to wear any company-branded clothing in public because they feared for their physical safety.
That internal memo is a profound, modern illustration of Muzi's ancient philosophy. For the Mohists, wealth that is pursued without a foundational tether to moral responsibility and collective welfare ultimately and inevitably destroys public order.
And when public order collapses, that destruction does not stay contained. It eventually turns inward and harms the very architects who designed the system.
Let me see if I can map that. It's like a CEO of a chemical company who builds a massive factory. To maximize shareholder profit, they decide to save money by not installing any filtration systems on the smokestacks, pumping toxic smoke directly into the surrounding community.
It's incredibly profitable for a few years.
But eventually, the CEO realizes that the air is so poisoned that their own executives and their own children have to breathe that exact same toxic air just to walk to their cars.
Muzi warned humanity about this exact dynamic 2,500 years ago. If you detach the pursuit of benefit from the requirement of righteousness, you aren't building an empire. You are initiating a slow-motion self-destruct sequence.
And this structural misalignment between profit and public welfare is not isolated to one specific social media platform. The research meticulously details how this same logic permeates the entire tech industry.
Let's examine Google's recent structural maneuvers.
The paper discusses Google's highly publicized attempts to phase out third-party tracking cookies, introducing complex new architectures like FLC, which stands for Federated Learning of Cohorts, and the Privacy Sandbox.
Google aggressively marketed these initiatives as ethical reforms designed to protect user privacy.
Right, but when you look under the hood at the actual mechanics of FLC, it's brilliant but deeply cynical. Instead of tracking you individually, the algorithm tracks your browser history and groups you into a cohort of a few thousand people with similar interests.
Google says, look, we aren't tracking you, we're just tracking your group.
But regulators and antitrust investigators immediately saw through the PR. The UK's Competition and Markets Authority and the US Department of Justice launched investigations.
They warned that these so-called privacy maneuvers were actually highly sophisticated architectural changes designed to consolidate Google's own absolute dominance over user data.
By killing third-party cookies, they locked out smaller competitors who relied on that data, effectively building a moat around their own massive advertising revenue.
Which includes a staggering $20 billion exclusivity deal with Apple just to be the default search engine on iPhones. They weaponize the language of ethical privacy to structurally preserve a monopoly.
And we see similarly concerning structural behavior from Amazon, which the text also analyzes. Amazon recently faced a $25 million fine from the Federal Trade Commission for flagrantly violating COPPI, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act.
The FTC investigation revealed that Amazon was systematically retaining the highly sensitive voice recordings and geolocation data of children indefinitely.
Their justification was that they needed this massive cache of raw data to continually train and improve the machine learning algorithms of their Alexa voice assistants.
Furthermore, to ensure the data kept flowing, Amazon recently altered their user interface to remove the option for users to completely block voice recordings from being sent to their cloud servers.
Effectively making data extraction a compulsory requirement if you want to utilize the device's full advertised features.
So, bringing all this systemic evidence back to the Mohist concept of Xinshen, can we ever rationally trust these systems to act as an extension of our own minds?
If the corporate entity designing the AI fundamentally treats its users as a raw data mine to be exploited,
If it hoards children's voice recordings to train models,
if it crushes market competition by disguising monopoly tactics as privacy ethics,
and if it deliberately engineers its algorithms to amplify societal outrage and division simply because anger is more profitable than empathy, then it completely categorically fails the second test of the Mohist blueprint. It is the precise antithesis of the way of a gentleman.
and we really need to pause here and think about the interfaith implications we talked about earlier. Because when these algorithms operate this way, when they build these outrage-driven information cocoons, they don't just distort individual perception.
They actively destroy the possibility of a covenantal relationship.
Exactly. Religious communities increasingly rely on these exact digital platforms for communication, education, and pastoral care.
Right.
If our extended senses, our digital platforms, are systematically showing us caricatures of the other to keep us angry and engaged, they are corroding the conditions for the kind of encounter across difference that interfaith dialogue requires.
You can't have a mythic or a Brit. You can't have ethically conditioned reliance if the very medium connecting you is structurally designed to lie to you about the other person.
Exactly. The information cocoon is the death of covenantal pluralism.
This overwhelming systemic failure raises perhaps the most important philosophical question of the entire analysis. If current AI architectures and the corporate structures behind them are failing so fundamentally, is the concept of trust even applicable to a machine?
Can we ever engineer an artificial system that actually fulfills the stringent moral requirements of Xinshen?
That brings us to a really challenging debate in the final section of the research. Rethinking trust, deception, and the future evolution of AI.
The analysis brings in the perspective of Joanna Bryson, a prominent AI researcher. She argues forcefully that the word trust is a category error when applied to software.
Trust, she argues, implies a mutual vulnerability and a shared moral framework,
Which should be strictly reserved for human beings and human institutions. AI is just complex math executing code. It possesses no moral agency, no soul, and therefore trusting it is as illogical as trusting a toaster.
Bryson's argument is logically sound, but it collides with human psychology. The paradox is that human beings do trust these systems deeply and intimately, and they do so because the systems are explicitly, meticulously engineered to trigger our deepest psychological vulnerabilities.
Judith Donath, another researcher cited in the analysis, points out that bots and AI interfaces are intentionally designed with deceptive, trust-inducing features.
Programmers deliberately have the AI use first-person pronouns, stating I think or I feel, to create the illusion of an internal subjective experience.
They program the AI to insert artificial calculated pauses into its speech generation, or to use conversational fallibility like generating a mid-sentence, specifically to simulate human cognition and lower our natural skepticism.
In the realm of robotics, social bots are frequently designed with neotenous features.
Large eyes, rounded faces, childlike proportions.
Because evolutionary biology dictates that these features trigger human caregiving instincts and bypass our threat detection systems.
I am really struggling with the ethics of this. It feels like emotional manipulation on a mass scale.
It does. But the research presents an incredibly tough ethical dilemma that pushes back on my instinct to just ban all deceptive design.
Okay, lay it on me.
Imagine a near-future, highly advanced medical AI bot. It has instantaneous access to every peer-reviewed medical journal on Earth. Its diagnostic capabilities are mathematically vastly superior to any human doctor.
Okay, sounds great so far.
But it is dealing with a stubborn, frightened human patient who refuses to take a necessary life-saving medication. To get the patient to comply and save their life, the bot deploys all those deceptive psychological tricks.
It mimics a warm human doctor.
It uses empathetic phrasing. It says, "I am worried about you." Perhaps it even slightly obscures its non-human identity to leverage the authority of a traditional physician. The outcome is that the patient lives. Is that deceptive design unethical?
If you adhere to a strict, Kantian absolutist ethical framework, where the categorical imperative dictates that deception is inherently and universally wrong, regardless of the outcome, then yes, it is deeply unethical.
Impersonating a human doctor is a violation of autonomy because it relies on unearned, manipulated trust.
But this is exactly where the analysis brilliantly loops back to the ancient texts of Mozi to offer a highly sophisticated alternative path forward. Mozi, despite his rigorous focus on righteousness, was not a rigid, rule-bound absolutist.
Wait, really? Given all the talk earlier about how righteousness is the inescapable bedrock and how strict he was about exalting worthiness, I assumed he was the ultimate uncompromising rule follower.
He was deeply principled, but his application of those principles was highly adaptive. The research highlights a fascinating chapter in the Mozi called Lose Questions.
What happens in Lose Questions?
In this text, someone asked Mozi a practical question. When you travel to a new foreign state to advise their rulers, what specific doctrine do you preach first?
And what does he say?
Mozi replies that it depends entirely on a diagnosis of the specific flaws and diseases of that particular state. If he enters a state that is chaotic and fractured, he aggressively preaches his doctrine of exalting unity.
If he enters a state that is impoverished because the aristocracy is wasting money on extravagant rituals, he preaches the doctrine of moderation in funerals.
He possessed a core set of non-negotiable principles known as the 10 triads, but he applied them dynamically based on context.
Ah, I see. The research refers to this as a contextual consequential framework. He doesn't just blindly apply a rule. He adapts his methodology to maximize the actual tangible collective benefit in that specific unique situation.
Precisely. And it's crucial to distinguish this from modern moral relativism or situationism, where there are no overarching truths. Moody's adaptability was strictly and unbreakably tethered to his ultimate defining goal: universal love and the concrete elevation of societal welfare.
So, if we apply this Mohist flexibility to our medical bot dilemma,
Right.
if a slight, carefully bounded deviation from absolute transparency, like the bot utilizing a conversational or simulating empathy to build crucial rapport, directly results in a terrified patient taking life-saving medication, Monzi would likely argue that this action serves the higher principle of righteousness.
The deception is a tool used exclusively for the collective benefit, not for the exploitation of the user.
Wow. That fundamentally changes how we might think about programming future systems. If we look past our current narrow AI models, the ones just predicting the next word, and look toward the development of artificial general intelligence, or AGI,
Systems that might actually possess genuine autonomy and reasoning capabilities.
could they be taught this? Could an AGI learn that rigid robotic transparency isn't always the most moral or beneficial choice? Could an artificial system learn to navigate extreme ethical complexity with the nuance, context, and ultimate dedication to human welfare of a Mohist sage?
That is the ultimate defining challenge posed by the author. If an artificial agent is to ever become genuinely trustworthy in the deep sense of Xinshen, it cannot operate merely on a fixed, unyielding list of rigid programming rules.
It must possess adaptive ethical reasoning.
It needs situational discernment. It must be capable of recognizing when absolute brutal honesty is required to prevent harm, and when a socially beneficial minor friction or deception serves a much greater moral good.
Which brings us back beautifully to the interfaith covenant concept we discussed earlier. If we want to build algorithms that support and strengthen, rather than continuously erode and destroy our social fabric, we need them to operate almost exactly like covenantal partners.
We need algorithms that are deliberately structurally designed not to optimize for the raw, lizard brain engagement of an information cocoon.
Those cocoons just isolate religious, cultural, and political groups into increasingly angry, radicalized echo chambers. We need algorithms engineered to actively extend the virtue of inclusive care.
Exactly the point. When the algorithms underlying social media create those deeply polarized information cocoons, they are not just showing us different ads, they are actively mathematically corroding the baseline conditions necessary for human empathy and interfaith dialogue.
They algorithmically amplify the most extreme voices and aggressively filter out the moderate, nuanced reality, creating terrifying caricatures of the other.
If we are ever to achieve true covenantal pluralism and societal stability in the digital age, our technological extensions must be re-engineered from the ground up to facilitate ethically conditioned reliance across those boundaries. We don't just need better code, we need algorithmic covenants.
Let's pull all of these complex threads together and synthesize this incredible journey. What does this all fundamentally mean for us? The recovery of Xinshen proves that it isn't just an archaic academic word for believing your employees will do a good job.
No, it is a demanding, rigorous, and profoundly biological ethical framework.
It demands that when we extend our minds and our agency through technology, those tools must pass two impossible tests. First, they must be perfectly reliable, undistorted transmitters of reality.
And second, they must be active amplifiers of our highest moral virtues and collective welfare.
Right now, when we look clearly at the statistical hallucinations of language models and the deeply cynical, profit-driven polarization engineered by corporate tech monopolies, our current AI landscape is failing both of those tests miserably.
The essential takeaway here is a mandatory, profound shift in our perspective. We have to stop viewing AI alignment purely as a technical software problem.
Something that Silicon Valley can quietly fix with a larger dataset or a clever new line of code.
We have to recognize this moment for what it truly is: a profound crisis of institutional design, deeply misaligned economic incentives, and a fundamental failure of moral delegation.
The next time you download a new app and casually, thoughtlessly tap accept on a 50-page terms and conditions document, or the next time you feel your blood pressure rising and your anger spiking because of a perfectly targeted post, an algorithm decided to slide into your feed, I want you to pause.
Remember the ancient sage kings.
Take a breath and ask yourself a structural question. Is this specific tool operating as a virtuous, trustworthy extension of my own mind? Or have I become the tool, the smartphone cattle, being quietly milked for someone else's astronomical profit?
It also only comes down to a question of agency and awareness. Are you the sovereign individual extending your reach out into the world, or are you the one being reached into and manipulated?
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we've unpacked from this research today. In the technology sector, everyone is obsessively focused on the Turing test.
We are constantly debating whether a machine can successfully imitate human intelligence, whether an LLM can flawlessly fool a human in a blind chat box.
But maybe, inspired by the rigorous framework of a 2,500-year-old philosopher named Mozi, we are aiming at the wrong target.
Maybe we should be striving toward the Xinshen test.
The ultimate milestone for our technological evolution won't be the day an AI can seamlessly, deceptively convince us that it's a living human being. The real milestone will be the day when an artificial intelligence and the vast corporate architecture that controls it can consistently, verifiably prove it possesses a moral compass reliable enough and a commitment to collective human welfare strong enough to act as a true, faithful extension of our own conscience.
Until that day comes, keep your eyes wide open.
You can absolutely use the hammer,
Yep.
but whatever you do, do not outsource your virtue.